Chapter 5. Holy Humanism. A poem to pave the way. The following poem that I wrote several years ago implies that we are better off to accept physical reality, excruciating pains and all, as it is, but be willing to make something good from it. It's a little more cynical than the adage, make lemonade out of lemons, but it conveys the same basic message. If we can rest in neutral mind and in simply being at a time when all hell breaks loose or we are living in a hell, and then vow to creatively adapt instead of crying over spilt milk or having a pity party, then we have a much better shot at living a fulfilling life. We can have a life filled with meaning and promise and a greater degree of wholeness. In Chapter 1, we discuss the concept of taking the mask off the monster during our nightmares. Something central about spirituality as an optional way emerged from the discussion. Spirituality is the alternative to the regular worldly way of trudging through life with direct effort, control, and focalized attention only. If we broaden our vision and loosen our grip, we often find creative ways to adapt and make lemonade out of the lemons. I recently came up with a meaningful jingle. Flesh manipulates. Spirit orchestrates. By loosening flesh's grip, spirit can orchestrate some tasty lemonade. Spirituality can transform our lives. It can transform you and me into a better version of ourselves. The poem states that physical existence itself can seem something like a monster. Facing it and working through it, processing as though sifting grain away from its chaff, can peel the monstrous mask right off the face of life and reveal something much more manageable and promising. Here's the poem. Pin the tail. It's a game we play. Blindfolded, disoriented. Trying to put the severed pieces back together. The pin feels like a nail. Even after the jackass is assembled, it's just nailed to reality. Stuck. And we can't escape that. Not really. Not with games. Not even with poetry. All we can do is accept it. As it is. Pricked and bleeding as we are. And allow it to somehow improve the shape of our own and each other's being. End of poem. The poem seems quite cynical about physical existence. But if you read between the lines and if you focus on the poem's ending statement, it is quite optimistic. It suggests that somehow or another the divine wholeness/oneness manages to be embedded in the jackass. The potential for creative correction of the messes in reality, transformative improvement of life, and spiritual growth of people still exists, although usually in a hidden form waiting for us to discover. It's no wonder that the notion of a creator is a major way of seeing the God we try to connect with, pray to, worship. It is not the highest, truest face of God. The interactive power of love and the stabilizing power of faith and peace as rooted in beingness seems deeper and truer, closer to the main nature of God. But creativity, especially in the form of creative problem solving, is an important God function that we need to access and utilize. We need to use it to make lemonade out of life's lemons. Becky and I were blessed to see the movie Soul on Fire on Netflix last night. It was based on a true story about a boy who was horribly burned from playing with fire and gasoline and was given only 1% or 0 chances of survival. But once the boy indicated to his mother that, despite the horrible situation, he still wanted to live, all sorts of people pitch in to help him achieve this seemingly impossible goal. Not only to survive, but to thrive. So many loving gifts are woven together to make for an amazingly full and productive life. Building God houses. The secular name for the weaving could well be connectiveness. The name that might be used from a point of view somewhere in between religious and secular might be spirituality. The typical religious name is, of course, God. Whatever you call it, and whatever cognitive framework or house you use to access it, it works wonders in the lives of those who choose to acknowledge and use it. Those good choices and the resulting positive and often unexpected, miraculous outcomes evidence a whole realm of positive potential that humans can tap into, no matter how nailed to or crucified by physical reality they happen to be. I believe that connectiveness comes from a deep unknown realm that is more dynamically interactive than the part of reality we see on the surface. Quantum scientists and theorists tend to agree with me, or vice versa, I agree with them. They call it quantum entanglement. When trying to apply the familiar logic of surface reality, the way deep physical reality behaves and the logic it is governed by appears to be like a tangled-up fishing line. The apparent tangle is the result of the wrong kind of logic. In terms of some dynamic and holistic and poetic logic that we humans have yet to master, the tangle is probably more like a graceful dance. The ways of the deep are confusing, as though a tangled mess, to us humans familiar with the ways of the surface. Some people accept the confusion by embracing the mystery. Even hard-nosed objective scientists who generate more questions than answers from their exploration of deep physical reality seem to embrace the mystery whenever they continue to explore and wonder and theorize. I agree with Carl Sagan that science and religion appear to converge at the most sincere, painfully honest levels of thought. What I think of as being an individual spirit or the connected self is simply a part of that mysteriously deep part of reality. It appears to be another side because we have trouble thinking the way that makes sense of it. It is our own mind's limitation that leaves us on the other side of whatever that deep reality is. I have elsewhere proposed thinking like energy as contrasted to thinking like matter as a possible helpful tool for wrapping our heads around a deep interconnected or spiritual realm or side. The aptitudes of the right brain hemisphere and the prefrontal cortex probably play a major role in beginning to transcend the tangle and make sense of the ways of the deep. Traditionally, koans like the sound of one hand clapping have been used to shift over to the poetic logic at which such brain parts excel. The biblical book of Job ends in what appears to be a kind of koan. After the exhausting regular logic of Job's friends and accusers, a young fellow named Elihu steps up and redirects everyone's attention to the ineffable beauty and wonder of creation. It is then that Job experiences a liberation from what he and his cohorts perceive to be God's judgment. Elihu successfully reintroduces Job to God's grace. Traditional interpretations of the book of Job emphasize Job's tenacious faith. And this is not entirely wrong. Job did hang in there with the faith of the type that he and his cohorts had at the time. But, to me, the best interpretation of the book of Job is that he was introduced to a whole new kind of faith, a faith based on an appreciation of the logic of the deep stance, the free flow of God's grace. Spiritual growth usually involves greater understanding, although for some folks the understanding may be more experiential and empirical, what works, than intellectual. For others it may be both, giving rise to somewhat logical dynamic concepts that provide a house where we can access deepest source. JC once used the metaphor of wineskins to describe the belief framework we use to support our connection with deepest source or ultimate reality or God. Intellectual understanding does not by itself make us closer to God, but it can humbly serve that potential experience and attainment. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, said that cognitive belief can be a useful map that helps us make the experiential spiritual journey. Christ's wineskins, my house, and C.S. Lewis map are metaphors of our metaphysical assumptions. I encourage people to find whatever belief helps them best access and utilize a loving God, as opposed to a strictly powerful God. Love nurtures the positive potential of human beings. A peaceful God ain't shabby either. We need peace to stabilize our love. As much as we need relating love, we also need being peace. One of Stephen Covey's 7 habits is begin with the end in mind. Love and peace together are the end we should have in mind when we begin our faith journey. The kind of God we conceptualize needs to be a house where the home of love and peace is experienced. I use this little saying that helps me judge beliefs by their fruits. The yes we need to be determines the God we need to see. If we want to be loving and peaceful, we need to choose beliefs about the nature of God that support that goal, bear that fruit. Logic that is not tethered to sound core values can end up making more swords than plowshares. Sadly, much of Christianity has lost sight of the core values espoused by Christ. Some churches are supporting social/political practices that resemble hate more than love. They allowed logic to be misused to justify unhealthy, unchristian, emotional reactions and urges. The specific belief is a means, not the end. The belief in an individual spirit happens to work for me, and I suspect it can work for others too. That's the reason I'm writing a whole book about it. I hope it can be a belief that helps you as the reader and participant in this discussion more fully utilize God, deepest source, or great unknown. Is the empty chair empty? I had 2 more recent dreams that support the premise of this book. But there are also 2 different ways of interpreting these dreams. One of the ways is metaphysical. This book accepts the metaphysical explanation of a spirit interacting with a physical being. The other way of interpreting these and other dreams is psychological. Both can work equally well. A useful psychological way of interpreting these dreams comes from Gestalt therapy. According to the theory behind Gestalt therapy, the dream characters are mental projections that, ideally, we should attempt to psychologically reclaim. This would lead to a better integrated personality and the sense of wholeness that accompanies it. It is also plausible that both the metaphysical reentry and the psychological reclamation processes are going on at the same time. The metaphysical explanation need not be at odds with the psychological explanation. With these 2 lenses in place, let's look at my most recent instructive dreams. I suppose that by this time you might want to rename this book Daryl's Book of Dreams. Here we go again. The first dream happened a night or 2 before the second. In that first dream, I, the main character, was walking quietly past glass sliding doors of someone's bedroom where they were sleeping. I didn't want to wake them up. I guess I failed because in the process, I did wake up. And rather dramatically at that, with a cramp in my right leg's calf muscle. Although I did not have a specific recall of the positioning of the dream characters laying in a bed, it seems more likely that they would be sleeping with their feet, rather than their heads, nearest the glass doors. Those dream characters seemed to be a representation of my wife and me sleeping in bed. It was another example of a semi-lucid incorporation of backstage events, with events on the dream drama stage. The connected self could have been in the process of entering my concrete self near the foot of my bed. Did it re-enter my calf muscle through the glass doors? I strongly suspect that to be the case. Instead of the knitting sensation I experienced during my previous astral projection experience, I had a knotting sensation. Perhaps the energy surge occurring during the re-entry process was just enough to trigger the muscle's predilection for knotting due to dehydration or other physical factors. In terms of my dreaming mind's level of lucidity, I appeared to being oh so close to realizing that my spirit was part of me. I could sense the connected self and the concrete self being close together. But I still wasn't aware that they both were part of me. The dream character was still a relative stranger to the person named Daryl who was lying in bed. The connected self, stranger, was lurking about the familiar me, my concrete self. So, the re-entry process was rather rough, resulting in spasms. Lucidity progress seemed to have occurred in the second dream. I was walking with a supportive guide, a bearded black man, when I was telling him about my astral projection experiences. Before I could tell him the main part of my story about re-entering my body, he said that to me. It was like someone stealing a Joker's punchline. I told him that was what I was going to say. Did it happen to you too? The dream ended there. No spasms. No intense feelings. The re-entry process went easier and smoother than in the dream a night or 2 earlier. I appeared to have a semi-lucid awareness that my connected self, in this case, the bearded black man, was part of me, not merely a stranger lurking about as in the first dream. I was more trusting of my spirit and more trusting of the process of re-entry. This composure reminds me of the main goal of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to prepare us for a calm transition to the other side as we die. The authors of that spiritual text appeared to think we can avoid unnecessary reincarnations, wondering if we can understand and accept the transition at the moment it occurs. That feels like the Super Bowl of lucidity and integration. Lucid at the very end. Walking hand in hand with one's spirit. Aware of one's true nature as spiritual being connected to God. Interesting and seemingly significant that my connected self was telling me that the higher-ups approved of my writing text that I was trying to put together from disjointed pages, not having a great deal of luck. So, my dream guide seemed quite encouraging, uplifting. I was being reassured that I would eventually be able to collect the thoughts worth expressing. The alternate interpretation of the two dreams is that the characters in the dream are mental projections of parts/aspects of me, not metaphysical beings or things. Gestalt therapy uses an empty chair as a prop for imagining that they are talking to someone there. That someone is later discovered to be a projection of themselves. If all goes well, the projection eventually gets reclaimed by the person who is going along with the little psychodrama. The person owns the previously disowned part of themselves and now is freer to have the emotions associated with the projection instead of those emotions having them. Perhaps the imaginary being in the chair represents the anger that the person was afraid to claim as their own. If so, the imaginary person would probably do a bit of angry backtalk. The person in therapy would have to confront the angry person/projection until such time that the Gestalt therapy participant becomes aware that the anger is actually a part of themselves. The same kind of mental projection that goes on in the empty chair technique goes on in a dream. Given this interpretation, the character lurking in my first dream was a part of me that I either disowned, perhaps due to negative qualities I didn't want to own up to, or simply hadn't discovered yet about myself. It could even be a quite positive quality, but one that would lead to me doing things I have been afraid to commit to. With power comes responsibility. Owning one's responsibility to develop and use a certain gift could bring consequences that the dreamer is not yet willing to forego. Perhaps an inconvenient truth that rocks the boat too much? Articulating truths that others are not yet willing to accept has caused many people throughout history to be persecuted. JC was one of them. The masses could not grasp the true, spiritual meaning of his teachings. His attempt at spreading enlightenment turned out to be a bridge too far, although a seed may have been planted for enlightenment sometime in the future, during a second coming of the spiritual message. My first dream could have been a dress rehearsal or trial run for the second dream. Perhaps it planted the seed that would sprout in a future dream, akin to the hoped-for second coming of Christ's enlightenment project. In my second dream, the guide beside me gave me the affirmations I needed. He sweetened the pot to help me feel that the benefits of me submitting my insights, symbolized by the pages in disarray, or gifts to others outweighed the cost of rocking the boat or failing to deliver. He gave me courage, encouraged me. And so, my mental projection of the positive quality or worthwhile insight was not pushed away. There was no lurking, only walking side by side with it. When he said what I was going to say, it was either a full reclaiming of the mental projection of my own gift or was awfully infused with awe close to it. In one dream of mine from many years ago, my anger self and me fully integrated, in that his breathing and mine became one. This was a feeling. In the most recent dream, it was a sharing of thoughts and experiences, perhaps not quite as fully integrated as the feeling of unity. But I'll count it as good progress anyways. If a dream is analogous to imagining aspects of ourselves onto empty chairs and does not really involve a physical or metaphysical other side, then the human development of increased personality integration could be explained by a strictly secular form of humanism. Finally getting around to the title of this chapter. But if the projections are either fully or partially aided via manifestations from another dimension, then a kind of holy humanism would seem to best explain the healing and increased integration that occurs during these nighttime psychodrama sessions, what I call my night school. It is my belief that the agents in my dreams are assisted by something from a qualitatively different origin that is of another dimension. Some of the healing and integration process seems attributable to energies entering this physical dimension from some other dimension too deep to clearly discern from here. I think we have an individual spirit assigned to each of us. That spirit assists us in healing the brokenness of ourselves and the brokenness of the world. This belief is highly similar to the notion that we have a friend in Jesus. JC was a highly spiritual person among us. He was / is an analog of a helpful spirit. The Jesus that Christians worship could well be a powerful symbol of our individual spirits. A personal relationship with Jesus is a way for some to get to know their connected self. But Jesus can't just be a one-size-fits-all spirit if he is to meet us where we are. Jesus, like God the Father, needs to be individualized according to our ability to receive him. An individual spirit is but an extension of Jesus and God. It in no way is a replacement. And in no way is it contradictory to the worship of Jesus and God if we should choose to get to know and work with our individual spirit. Secular humanism may well suffice, but I feel that the process is a bit too mystical for that to be the whole picture. Not to mention, which, as I said before, means to mention, the fact that I am accumulating experiences that evidence some sort of energetic movement out and back into the body. I choose to believe that there is an actual other self, a connected self, that helps regular old me. It is a way that God stays in touch. And even if I'm wrong, it is at least a meaningful myth that works for me, helps me actualize my spiritual potential. Reverse levitation. A dream I had the night before last inspired a new meaningful myth. The story is about the possible metaphysics that led up to each of us having an individual spirit that interacts with us in the physical dimension. Before I describe the dream, I need to share some background theological insights that came to me in the days and weeks before it. These insights helped form the dream's theme. Standard Christian theology paints a picture of an all-powerful supreme being who intentionally fashioned creation and then allowed each of us to have free will so our love for him is genuine instead of a mechanical response. This story works until you explore the logical implications of an all-powerful creator. If the creator is all-powerful, then the intense suffering that unfortunately goes on in the otherwise beautiful masterpiece is allowed sooner or later. Some of the suffering can be bypassed if we choose wisely and don't go down the dead-end streets of sin. Sin is when we choose to get stuck on any given part of reality that prevents us from being open to the wholeness to which the parts are connected. But some of the suffering has nothing to do with our sin. Horrible things happen to very good people. Participating in life leaves us vulnerable to victimization. It's just the way creation is designed. If an all-powerful God designed it, then he allowed the suffering. The fact that we could choose God's love or grace to offset or even transcend the suffering does not prevent its infliction upon us. It's understandable that God enjoys us choosing to love him. What being would not prefer to be loved? But if our suffering is the price he makes us pay so that we can turn to him out of love, then we are put into a position of being victims. Like it or not, we are placed into a difficult situation in which we just might provide the love that God desires. It seems like a sadistic video game that God likes to play, one that we can't opt out of unless we choose to end our lives. Or God appears to have Munchausen disorder that makes him dependent on making us sick so he can cure us. He's a nurse that injects poison into us so he can care for us. The logical conclusion is that an all-powerful God cannot be an all-loving God. Unfortunately, it points out a very inconvenient truth. At least it's inconvenient if we feel we must depend on an all-powerful God. Those who are individually or collectively struggling to survive would crave power because their situation leaves them feeling powerless. If you are cold and naked, you understandably become obsessed with finding the power to acquire and wear warm clothes. You may be willing to kill a bear, overpower it, in order to clothe yourself in its warm furry coat. So, it's understandable how religion in the past, when everyone was struggling just to survive, would insist on an all-powerful God. But as we collectively evolve past the basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we are freer to focus on something as beautiful and meaningful as love. Power and greatness become less important. Love and goodness become our main foci. We have enough power and mastery to afford a higher thing. Turns out, power is a lower thing as compared to love. If we are honest, life, having the power to be alive, is not worth much without love and beauty. Beauty is but a different form of love. We love the beautiful arrangements life offers. Without any prospect of love and beauty, we had just as soon die. Fortunately, creation has plenty of love and beauty in it. Suffering is but a part of the picture. Where does that leave those of us who are blessed to have a more evolved spiritual understanding than our forefathers and mothers? It leaves us with an opportunity to choose a loving God who is not all-powerful, but who is nonetheless sufficiently powerful to help us fix a cosmic accident. If the inevitable suffering we encounter in the physical plane is the result of an accident, we can no longer blame God for it. Instead, we can choose to do our part to help ultimate reality or God fix the problem. And it appears that God graced us with individual spirits, so we could have the spiritual power to help God in the grand reclamation project. Now the stage is set for the telling of my dream. I was levitating above people in a church or educational setting. I was sure that my levitation would be sufficient evidence that there is a spiritual dimension we could tap into. But they would not, or could not, acknowledge that I was, in fact, levitating, hovering slightly, only 3 or 4 feet above. It seems interesting that my feet were not way above the rest of the people in the dream. I was still in their zone of living, but slightly elevated. One would think that this proximity would help the people understand. But even that was insufficient. Could they not see the anomaly, the miracle of sorts? That's the story, at least the main part of it, as best as I recall. What was the dream showing me? You? In the dream, I was levitating. This seemed an exception to the rule. But what if, out of my bias of thinking we must walk on the ground, I got it backwards? What if my connected self was doing what was normal to it, moving gently about in the astral plane like an angel with wings? What if the abnormal ones were the people, my concrete self included, who couldn't levitate and who couldn't even appreciate the possibility of it? Soon after I woke from the dream, I imagined an interesting mythical account of creation. God's fingers and hands started getting heavy. Soon his fingers fell off, then his hands, then his arms, then his feet, then his legs. How would you feel if your body parts fell off you? Wouldn't you want them back so your being would once again be complete? In my little myth, God wants his parts back. But try as he might, he can't accomplish this feat on his own. He needs the body parts, which have somehow retained some of his power, as satellites of his being, to help get themselves back into place. He must work through them. He cannot fix the problem by merely working on them. We are the fallen God parts. Our individual spirits, our connected selves, is the way God works through us, but can override the free will of the body parts. If we can manage to see the natural workings, the spiritual ways of our individual spirit, then we can help move the parts back to God. But if we fail to acknowledge the special aptitudes of our own connected self, we will be limited to the ways of the physical plane of existence. Our concrete self will not know or understand our connected self. And by our, I may well mean my. That is, my concrete self was not understanding or appreciating my connected self. Presumably, the same applies to all of us. I am but one of many of God's fallen body parts. My made-up metaphysical story left out one thing. For the individual spirit to participate in the grand reclamation project, it must accept the mission, which includes the occasional dread of not being able to fly and the frequent frustration of its host's refusal to acknowledge it and work with it. The connected self must endure the frustration of seeing and feeling the concrete self drop the ball that the connected self passed to it. Not once or twice, but over and over again. As I indicated earlier in the book, I borrowed that whole spirit accepting the assignment part of the story from New Age thought. But it works for me, so now it's my own sub-story, and I'm sticking to it. The trial. Night school has been interesting lately. Last night it had me standing trial. While the court was on recess, I was doing flips through doors and hallways. My lawyer had spent a lot of court time setting up a stage that looked like I was at home instead of in an impersonal chair. Within the dream itself, I appreciated the care that my advocate was taking. I knew it was to help make me look human instead of being objectified as a mere defendant. I was able to talk comfortably with the members of the jury. Oddly, one of the jurors got up off his seat and came beside me to talk. He seemed a bit confused, perhaps mentally ill, and his pants were urine-soaked as though he had just had an accident. Then another person appeared. She was wearing a badge. Although clearly a court official, she was warm and friendly, appearing to be more of an advocate than part of the prosecution. At one point, the setting included a person lying in bed. That was a semi-lucid awareness of me lying there dreaming. Was the psychologically challenged juror my confused self? The urinary incontinence accident probably was my semi-lucid awareness of needing to go to the bathroom. I didn't want to pee on myself in bed. The female court official was probably a representation of my wife who was lying there in bed next to me as I was dreaming. Anyone who has been in a relationship knows that we are occasionally tested, put on trial. Will I intimately share enough, manage my anger well enough, care for my partner enough to keep from destroying our love relationship? Again, a semi-lucid, behind-the-scenes element in the dream. Perhaps my ability in the dream to flip in midair as I was going through a door was another semi-lucid awareness that my connected self was literally hovering and/or tumbling above me. The door may have been the pathway between my embodied concrete self and my disembodied connected self. Why a trial? My guess is that the earthly mission with which my connected self is assisting me has tests that I may or may not pass. The verdict is not out yet. But the fact that my connected self, the lawyer, made me feel at home, and the fact that I was doing flips during recess, suggests a welcome degree of faithful confidence that I can pass the tests, be found innocent, spiritual. The trial was a variation of my night school's pop quizzes. I got at least a B+ on that one. I sense that I am growing spiritually as we speak. Rather, as I dream. Show Me the Way. Singer-songwriter Peter Frampton's famous song, Show Me the Way, came to mind as I reviewed the night school session from the night after the dream about the trial. It was as if I was singing Frampton's song to my connected self. I want you to show me the way. But my desire for my spirit to continue showing me the spiritual way to live was eclipsed by my thankfulness that it already did show me the way in that wonderful dream. I suppose I should change the lyric to, I thank you for showing me the way. But that would throw off the meter of this Velvet Rock song. Velvet Rock is what my dream was like. It rocked me, but in a velvet, soft power manner. Here is the account of the dream. I was visiting an extended family in their home. A grandfather had notions of what his grandson should grow up to be. It had something to do with being an aide. My memory is a bit fuzzy about what kind of aide, but it seemed like some sort of educational aide or informative consultant. I sensed it was about being knowledgeable about something, about having expertise in the domain of information and understanding. When the grandson was not interested in fulfilling this assigned role, the grandfather became indignant and cold toward his grandchild. As a visitor, I felt like it was an unfortunately awkward social situation. My inner therapist and healer stepped into my role within the dream. I was no longer just a visitor. I was a healer. As the grandfather was getting ready to drive away from the house, I reminded him that if he happened to die in a car accident, he would regret that his last moments on Earth involved his apparent withdrawal of love from his grandson. Did he really want to allow conditional love to contaminate his love relationship? Somehow, the grandfather was on top of the cab of a truck, which was also like the roof of a porch. I reached up and put a hand on the grandfather there. At that moment, I felt the full renewal of the grandfather's love for his grandson. I cried uncontrollably about the love I felt, even as I was aware that I had done a laudable act of healing. Were they tears of joy from having helped someone heal? Tears of celebration? Or tears about a love that was almost lost and achingly yearned to come home? Tears of lamentation? Or a mixture of both? At any rate, I woke up filled with the energy of love that had moved me, rocked me to tears. That's why I associate the dream with Velvet Rock music. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the dream had something to do with the power of love and about love as a spiritual thing we are trying to help one another master. But why the grandfather's forcefully promoting the job of some sort of information consultant for his grandson? And why was it labeled aide, which is a relatively low-status job as compared to a full-fledged professional occupation? My best guess is that the grandfather was my mind's representation of a version of the Heavenly Father, a version shaped by my own sensibilities and fears rather than God as God is. The grandson was probably my concrete self, or perhaps my inner child or my heart's desires. Limiting the child to aide position may have seemed more realistic, practical. All my Heavenly Father, as conceived, could expect of Daryl is that he might be an aid to others' understanding of spirituality. To say that the grandson, Daryl, should be a teacher or expert would seem presumptuous, overly prideful. Again, This is the father upon which Daryl was projecting certain characteristics. A truly loving God would not withdraw love for lesser considerations, such as notions of social appropriateness. The real God, the one I choose to believe in, would not play those games. Nonetheless, the Father God as conceived in my dream did. But even the humble version of a teacher who was an aide rather than head teacher was somehow not quite right for my concrete self. It was sensed as not being a good fit. It should not be forced upon me. When my connected self showed its masterful hand by literally showing its hand at healing, it revealed that love was more important than knowledge per se. Knowing with the heart and soul was more important than knowing with the head, the intellect. This interpretation jives well with my recent emphasis on conceptualizing and relating with a loving God, as opposed to a merely powerful God. Knowledge is power, but heart-sensed knowing of love is even more powerful, more important. The most recent night school session seemed to be a variation of the dream I had many years ago in which my spirit held my decapitated head and walked around with it. The God worthy of my worship wants me to have the job of loving. If God's name is BB, the base of being, then he is more like love than regular intelligence. Beingness and love are cut from the same cloth. The cloth is the deep interconnected substrate of a reality dominated by apparently separate objects on the surface, where we live out our short lives. Wrapping the gift. Holy humanism is a gift. It's a gift because it appropriately empowers humans with spirituality. It applauds human potential without forgetting about God or a deeper interconnected reality. It cuts out the authoritarianism that creeps into traditional religion, but doesn't diminish the important role of religion. It gives us an internal locus of control because it acknowledges our active necessary role in the grand reclamation project. God, or deep interconnected reality, needs us, and we need God, or deep interconnected reality.